Leaders' questions. I call on Deputy Dooley on behalf
Thanks,
of the
Count Corley. Taoiseach, on Sunday, public transport users are facing industrial action by hard-pressed Bus Eireann workers. This action has arisen, as you know, after 11 long months of deliberations, negotiations and protracted discussions between management, the Labour Court and those very workers. An impasse has now been reached. State subvention, as you know, Taoiseach, is down by about 15% of the company's turnover, cut dramatically under your stewardship, Taoiseach. It's the lowest level of subvention of any major national public bus company in Europe. Now, Taoiseach, workers should not be expected, in my view, to subsidise the cut to the Bus Eireann subvention. And I would have thought Labour in government, and most people would have thought Labour in government, would ensure that that didn't happen. You know, Taoiseach, that strike action will cause considerable inconvenience to the travelling public, to members of the public who depend on Bus Eireann to get to work, to get to school and indeed to get to college. Taoiseach, the public is shocked with the apparent approval of the Minister that Bus Eireann intends to unilaterally impose severe cuts in the pay and conditions of its workforce from Sunday next. Bus Eireann has outlined that it intends to target about 9 million of its 20 million savings target from the pay and conditions of its workforce. Bus Eireann needs to make savings, but the savings sought, in my view, weigh far too heavily on the workers who earn on average about 33,000 a year. They have families, Taoiseach, they have mortgages, and like many people in society, they're struggling. The Labour Court has stated that the very viability of the transport operator is under threat if something isn't done, and that's accepted on this side of the House. Now, Taoiseach, we know that Fine Gael want to privatise our public transport service, of which Bus Eireann is a constituent part of that. Where does the Labour Party stand on the privatisation of Bus Eireann? Now, it is estimated, Taoiseach, that about 114,000 students, secondary and indeed college-going students, will be affected if the dispute spreads to the school transport network. Now, that should bring into stark focus for the government the seriousness of this particular issue, and that action needs to be taken by you and government. So, Taoiseach, just a couple of very quick questions. Where do you stand on this particular issue? Where does the government stand on this issue? Does the government have a strategy to ensure that the public transport network will not let down those who cannot afford private transportation during this impasse? And does the government intend to intervene between management and staff to try and avoid a strike in the first instance?
Thank you, Deputy. Taoiseach.
Cancórla, Bus Eireann is in a very difficult financial position. It has incurred accumulated losses of €27 million in the last 5 years, a position which is unsustainable and which places the viability of the company at risk. According to the Labour Court and the trade union's own independent financial assessors, Bus Eireann is in a precarious financial situation with the very viability of the company under threat. According to the Labour Court, significant reductions in the company's cost base, including payroll costs, are essential to ensure its future and protect employment within the company. The issues involved have been the subject of deliberations for 11 months and have been the subject of a Labour Court adjudication. Following this adjudication, there was further engagement with the Labour Relations Commission. The future of the company needs to be secured for the public who depend on its services and for the benefit of its employees. Bus Eireann runs commercial expressway services, which are currently loss-making, and legally the state cannot support these services. The viability of these services can only be secured if these savings are achieved. Bus Eireann has confirmed to Ministers Varadkar and Kelly that the company remains open to engaging with the unions, and I very much hope that the management and the unions use the period between now and Sunday to engage in further dialogue which can ensure that the necessary savings are introduced and the provision of bus services for the public are protected.
Thanks very much, Taoiseach. You've set out the company position. One would have thought that the Labour Party in government would have looked at the workers' situation in this. And it's all right to talk about the Labour Court and the Labour Relations Commission. But effectively what's being imposed on the workers unilaterally here, Minister, those on an average of 33,000 a year are being asked to take a hit of €3,000. That's a phenomenal amount, Taoiseach, from the pay packets of these individuals and their families. It's not bonus pay. It's all right to talk about core pay and talk about overtime and time and a half and all that goes with it. But Taoiseach, a 3,000 cut to the core pay of these individuals is not sustainable. So do you want to put more people into hock by saying we got to protect the company? Go back and fight the case at government for increased subvention. If you, as a Labour Party, believe in public service obligation, believe in the principle of an appropriate transport network. So, we know where Fine Gael stand. They look after the people over 100,000. I would have thought that the Labour Party in government would look after those on €30,000 a year. But you seem to have just bought the company line. You're prepared to come in here and trot it out, with no reference whatsoever to the workers. You look across the line of Labour people here. Many of them have worked as trade union officers.
Deputy, would you put your question, please?
That you're not prepared to fight for a greater level of investment for the company to ensure that it can continue to provide a public transport service.
This government is committed to the public transport service. Public. And that is why we want to keep Bus Eireann in existence. Now, do you understand that? The viability of the company is at risk. The viability. No, please listen to the answer. Listen to the answer.
If the company, quieten down, please. Quieten down. I'd like to hear the answer as well as everybody else. Yeah. We've 1 minute to reply.
The viability of Bus Eireann is at risk. It's losing money. It has lost 27 million in the last 5 years, and that cannot continue. And if Bus Eireann does not continue to exist, then the people who work in it won't have jobs in it. And that's what we want to do. We want to protect the company, the services it provides, and the employment that it provides to those who work in it. In order to do that, the company has to be secured. This has been the subject of discussion and negotiation for 11 months. It is now the subject of a Labour Court recommendation. It is what the company is doing is implementing the Labour Court recommendation, which has been the subject of discussion over a long period of time. This is now about the viability of the company. And incidentally, that viability itself, the question of the viability of the company, is itself accepted by the assessors that were put in by the trade unions to look at this. Now, we have a period of time between now and the weekend in which further discussions can take place. The company has made it clear that it is available to have those discussions either directly with the unions or with the assistance of the Labour Court or the Labour Relations Commission. I hope that such discussions will take place. I hope that industrial action can be averted. But we do all need to understand that what is at stake here is the continued existence of Bus Eireann. And you coming in here and crying crocodile tears will be no use to anybody if this company fails and the people in it lose their jobs.
Thank you. Deputy MacDonald.
Taoiseach, this morning I want to raise with you the issue of access to resource teaching hours for children with Down syndrome. Down syndrome is, by its nature, complex and affects intellectual ability, speech, language, hearing, memory, vision, motor skills and general health. Taoiseach says, I'm sure you understand Down syndrome seriously affects a child's ability to engage with the school curriculum. It affects 1 in every 546 births in Ireland each year. So that means each year about 120 children are born with Down syndrome, and approximately 80 of these will begin mainstream primary education each year. So it is by definition a complex low incidence disorder, and yet remarkably it's not one of the 11 low incidence disabilities that qualify for resource teaching hours. Prior to 2005, all children with Down syndrome received resource teaching hours. But since then, children with Down syndrome who have IQ scores in the mild range of learning disability do not qualify for specifically allocated resource teaching hours. So, Taoiseach, this is an important issue which affects no more than about 24 to perhaps 30 children each year. And it could be easily resolved by simply adding Down syndrome to the list of low-incident disabilities. It's a small number of children, but the kind of support that would be afforded to those children could literally transform their lives and their learning experience. So, Taoiseach, I want to ask you what you might do to address this issue, if you might speak with the Minister for Education, whether or not you would be prepared to come back to the Dáil with the proposal to address what I think is an unfair discrimination against a section of children who have Down syndrome.
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Thanks, Ceann. I know that Down Syndrome Ireland organised a briefing here in Leinster House earlier this week for members of the House, at which they made the case that Down syndrome should be regarded as a disability in its own right, and that children with Down syndrome should qualify automatically for additional resource hours and resource assistance in the education system. I have got a report. I wasn't able to attend the briefing myself, but I did get a report on the briefing, and Minister Ruairi Quinn is already addressing the issues that have been raised in the briefing. He has asked the National Council for Special Education to provide expert, independent and evidence-informed policy advice on the education of children and others with disabilities. This will include the issue of whether Down syndrome should be reclassified as a low-incidence disability in all instances, regardless of assessed cognitive ability. This advice from the National Council for Special Education on how the education system can best support children with special educational needs is expected to be published in the coming weeks. I don't think that we should preempt just today what that expert policy advice will give, because the NCSE is an organisation with the greatest expertise in this area, and they've been asked to consider this policy issue. I want to assure the Deputy and the House that the Government and the Minister for Education is very conscious that meeting students' educational needs is a paramount consideration which must be kept at the centre of any proposals and recommendations. And as you know, the Government continues to spend €1.3 billion a year supporting the education of children with special needs. We're committed to continuing to explore how best to improve their experiences and their educational outcomes. We have heard the case that has been made by Down Syndrome Ireland, and as I've said, the Minister for Education is already addressing the issues that have been raised.
Deputy MacDonald.
Thank you, Taoiseach. And of course, I'm sure for all of us, the central concern is to ensure that all of our children have the best educational opportunities and supports. But I'm sure that you'll agree with me that in the case of a child with a disability, or for this purposes a child with Down syndrome, the duty on us is all the greater, because the need of the child is so much more. I'm glad to hear that Minister Quinn will have a report on the general issue of children with disabilities and how supports for them are provided. But this is a very specific instance, Taoiseach. And as I said to you, up until 2005, every child with Down syndrome was in receipt of teaching resource supports. Since that time, a segment of those children with Down syndrome have been denied that very basic support. I fully appreciate that policy has to be based on evidence and expertise, but can I put it to you that Down Syndrome Ireland have considerable expertise in this area, and equally that the state until 2005 recognised that every child with Down syndrome required resource support. So I think it was wrong for the previous administration to withdraw that. I think it's essential that this administration now put that matter to right. And Taoiseach, it affects a very small number of children, but should you do the right thing, it will make a huge, huge difference to those children and to their families. So can I ask Taoiseach if you can let us know at what stage you or the Minister for Education propose to come back on this specific issue, and to reassure all of us in the Dáil that these resource hours will be afforded to every child that has Down syndrome.
Thank you. Taoiseach.
Well, as I've said earlier, we have heard the case that was made by Down Syndrome Ireland. As you have said, they do know what they're talking about. They know it from experience, and we take that very seriously. As I said, I wasn't able to attend the briefing myself, but I did get a report on it from my parliamentary colleagues who did attend. We're addressing it. I said in my reply, and I repeat, that the assessment that is being done by the National Council for Special Education will include the issue of whether Down syndrome should be reclassified as a low incidence disability in all instances, regardless of assessed cognitive ability. So it is being addressed. The case that was made by Down Syndrome Ireland is being addressed by the Minister. He expects that to be in a position to publish the policy advice in the coming weeks. So we're not talking about a prolonged period of time here. We've heard the case that is made. It is being addressed. There is a process by which the Minister for Education is looking at it. The Down syndrome issue is very much part of that process, and I think we should await what that expert advice is. As I said, he'll be publishing it in a matter of weeks, and we've heard what the case that was made by Down Syndrome Ireland to the all-party group that they met earlier this week.
Thank you. Deputy Daly.
Thanks, John Corlett. Taoiseach, I think there's a certain tragic irony in the situation that as we sit here this morning, homeowners in Priory Hall are before the courts down the road as Dublin City Council seeks to get out of the responsibility of paying temporary accommodation for families who had the misfortune of purchasing a home in Priory Hall. Families who've lived on the knife edge for hundreds of days now in unsecure accommodation while continuing to pay a mortgage on buildings that are only fit to be knocked down. And isn't it ironic, Taoiseach, that 100 years ago in this city, James Connolly, your former party leader, fought against tenement buildings. Now on your watch, homeowners are being treated like evacuees, paying money for property that are debt traps and a health hazard. Isn't it ironic that James Connolly campaigned against William Martin Murphy and independent newspapers as the mouthpiece of the employers? On your watch, the new William Martin O'Brien and Independent News and Media get a bailout of 60 million at the taxpayers' expense. A real case of history repeating itself, but this time round, you, who claim to stand in the legacy of Connolly, are on the wrong side of the barricades. And it must have been pretty nauseating to take a lecture from Fianna Fáil about workers' rights and bus workers' rights, but it was even more nauseating to hear your response. You could have been Bus Eireann management. You could have been the way Fianna Fáil were when they were on your side of the House. And I'd like you to explain the journey that you've made onto the side of IBEC. The nation was treated to the views of IBEC earlier in the week when they told us they wanted an end of austerity. It had gone far enough. Sounded good until you looked at the small print. What they were actually talking about was making sure there'd be no austerity for them. By all means, they said, continue with the austerity on hard-pressed homeowners, fleece them for a home tax, go after them for a water tax, and when low and middle income earners had nowhere else to be got out of them, don't make sure by all means go after the high earners. Instead, they argue that you go after public sector workers again, and they were ably assisted in that by your Deputy Minister Howland. I'd really like to ask you, Taoiseach, what planet, or Taoiseach, what planet are you living on? Maybe it's the one where people like David Begg, who's on €140,000, puts forward the prospect for the unions to be realistic. Do you think it is realistic for low-paid public sector workers who've already had their salaries reduced by 22% to have it reduced further? Do you think it's realistic for unions to go into a process where their members will come out worse off? Would it not be more realistic
Deputy, you're over time, please.
Millionaires who've got richer on your watch by progressively taxing them as you said they would. And wouldn't that be something that a party that says it's going to represent workers would actually do?
Honest.
I get the impression that Deputy Daly doesn't think very highly of me.
No, you either, Jimmy.
First of all, I think the specific question was, do I support low-paid workers taking a further cut? No, I don't. And that is why the agreement that was proposed to the trade unions did not propose a cut in pay for low-paid workers. The cuts in pay that are proposed are graduated above a certain level. It is also why this government reinstated the cut in the national minimum wage, which was imposed by the previous government. It is also why we legislated to reintroduce the Joint Labour Committee system after it was struck down by the High Court, because we recognise that people who are in low pay need to have a statutory framework within which their pay and conditions are protected. People who are on low incomes, it is why this government has not reduced basic rates of social welfare payment, something that was done by the previous government. It's why this government took over 300,000 people out of the universal social charge, people who are on the lowest level of pay. So when it comes to protecting people who are on low pay, this government has taken repeated action and shows exactly where it stands, even in difficult circumstances. Of course, the issue of pay only arises if you have a job, and that is why our priority is to ensure, first of all, that we protect the jobs of those who have them. That is why we have pursued policies that have not involved, as they have in other countries, compulsory redundancy of those who work in our public services. That is why we want to protect those companies who employ people in our public transport system, for example. We do not want to see Bus Eireann, for example, fail and fail financially, which will result in the loss of jobs to people who work there. It is also why we are pursuing an economic strategy which is aimed at encouraging investment in this country by companies who establish subsidiaries here, who employ Irish workers. I'm very glad to see that over the course of recent times we have been successful in that. Last week alone, for example, over 2,000 new jobs announced, over 1,000 additional jobs in the private sector over the last 12 months, a turn in the numbers of people who are at work. It's not fast enough. We want to see a lot more done in terms of additional jobs being created. It's why, for example, we have put such an emphasis on youth unemployment, people who are coming out of schools and colleges who can't get the jobs that they're qualified for. That's why we got agreement at European level on the youth guarantee, supported by €6 billion of a youth investment fund. So it's about making sure that people have jobs, that those jobs are secure and that they're not put at risk, and that the best possible pay and conditions apply to them.
Thank you. Deputy Daly, supplementary question, please.
Taoiseach, of course, I have nothing against you personally. The point I was trying to make was that you do appear to be considerably out of touch with the reality on the ground. Your very reference to the idea of youth unemployment being dealt with by your government is masked by the fact that over 300,000 people have been driven from our shores over the past 4 years. We have a scenario on how your out-of-touchness is revealed, really, is the fact that workers in jobs, who are glad to be in jobs, have said clearly in the public sector and in Bus Eireann that they can give no more. And you see, the issue here is that there's never only one way to deal with something. The reality is that in that time, while workers' pay and conditions have been decimated, the amount of billionaires in Ireland has almost doubled since the crisis. The amount of millionaires has gone up to 751 in the country, and the amount of people earning over €300,000, and very few of them are in the public service, has gone up to almost 10,000 people. Now, is it not the case that a party that says it stands on the side of ordinary people should see its role as tackling inequality, not accelerating it? And should you not be dealing with taxing wealth rather than decimating workers' conditions? That, in reality, was the question.
Thank you. Understood.
Well, I've already dealt with one. I've already dealt with one end of the equation, which is what this government has done. And you know, it's not a case. It's very easy to come in and say it. It's not a case, Deputy Daly, of what we say. It's also what we do. And I've outlined to you very clearly what this government has done in order to protect the pay and conditions of people who are low-paid workers. The same applies to the issue of wealth. This government, in the last budget, introduced the largest package of taxes on wealth in this country that I can recall in my time here in this House. We've introduced, for example, a property tax with an additional tax on properties over €1 million. I drive past some of those properties and see the posters that you put up for their consideration, which is "Don't pay the property tax." So, you know, it's very easy to come in here and start bemoaning and complaining about millionaires and then put a sign on their road telling them that they shouldn't pay the property tax. You know, again, it is what you do. So, you know, saying it is one thing, but doing it is another, Deputy Daly. And that's the difference again between what you represent here and what the Labour Party represents here in government, and that is that we actually act to resolve the problems and to make things better rather than going on forever shouting about them.
Thank you. That